Good morning. Today's another one of our first fives. Today we're looking at this text from Matthew chapter 23, beginning with verse 13. Now, one of the things I want to say about this text before we really begin to look at it is most often we think of Jesus as incredibly compassionate, as gracious, as empathetic. We see all these great characteristics. We see his kindness towards children and women and the foreigner and all kinds of other things. And so we don't usually think of Jesus as judge. However, what we find throughout the Gospels is Jesus reserves his greatest judgments for those who call themselves the followers of God. And so for us today, that's really who he's targeting here. So here's what we find in Matthew chapter 23, beginning with verse 13. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides! You say if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but if anyone swears by the gift on it, he is bound by his oath. You blind men! Which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it, and he who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by God's throne, and by the one who sits on it. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. Now, this seems pretty harsh, and in fact, it actually is. Jesus is addressing the people who find themselves so committed to the rules of their understanding of what it means to follow God. They're so committed to these rules, this way of life, this moralistic approach to God, that they miss the relational aspects of God. They find themselves making it so hard for people to follow after God, to know God. They keep putting boundaries that keep others from who God is. They make these weird rules that work for them but don't really work for others. They've created systems of religious oppression, systems of worship that is oppressive. Like it's this broken system that they find they flourish in, but it requires the diminishment of others and making it harder for other people to come to know God. In fact, I love this last line of that very last verse. Here's what it said. It says, you give a tenth of your spices, so you pay your tithe, which is good, but you neglect these things. You neglect justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And he says, it's not that you shouldn't have done the first, because you should have, but you shouldn't have neglected these either. That both matter in the kingdom of God. So not only are we called to do particular practices to be the unique people of God, like to model generosity of our income and our stuff, that's a great thing. But not only do we model the giving of our stuff, but we also model justice and mercy and faithfulness. In other words, we offer the parts of Jesus, his life, that God shows us our reflection of his love and his character, and we see that throughout Jesus' life and ministry. And so the question for you and I today is this: are we willing to live as a people who do the right things? Like, Jesus isn't knocking the right things, but are we doing the right things? Like, here's a way I'll say this, that somewhat controversial maybe to some of you today who hear this. So often I hear people rail against rules and things that they think are just so wrong. And I'm not saying those things aren't wrong. You know, like I'll hear people yelling about gluttony who never have an issue with food. Or people yelling about abortion who can't even get pregnant. I mean, I'll hear these things, people yelling about these things. Don't get me wrong, those are wrong things. They're bad things, they're evil, they're sinful things. But most often I hear people yelling about those things. And yet if I were to talk about maybe gossip or envy or pride, then all of a sudden those would hit home to them. But they don't really rail on those. They only rail on the sins that really impact other people's lives. And that's what Jesus is warning against here. That if we're going to rail on one thing, we better also rail on the sins that impact us. Because if not, then we are these Pharisees, the hypocrites. That's then who we are. And so the challenge for you and I today is say, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And will you reveal to me the areas of life that I need to lay down and let go? The areas of life I need to say, these are yours. Father, forgive me. And to go with that, Father, help me to not live as a person who points out the flaws in others' lives without noticing my own. This idea that I would live with faithfulness and mercy and justice and live out from the right place. This is the challenge for you and I today. But here's the good news for us. Through the work of Jesus, God can and will do those things in our lives. So may the grace of God go with you this day. We'll catch you next time for another First Five.